Hi, this is Justin Colletti of SonicScoop. Thanks for joining me for this week's episode of the SonicScoop podcast. And today, we're going to be talking about mastering revisions, how they work, what to expect when you're getting your tracks, your songs mastered by a mastering engineer, how to go about the revisions process, because there's something that a lot of artists don't understand about getting the most out of potential revisions. Also, if you are mastering or trying to start mastering tracks for clients, for other people, then there are better and worse ways to go about doing revisions. Should you charge for them? If they're included, how many should you include? What about alternate versions of tracks? How does and how should all this stuff work? I've got some good answers for you on all of this stuff. I'll describe to you in great detail the way that I do this in case you want to be a mastering client of mine or you want to take a page out of my book and say, if it works for Justin, maybe it'll work for me. I'll do that too. But I'll also give you a sense of what some other people do and what the pros and cons there might be. But in addition to all of this, I also want to help you. If you're an artist, musician, a producer, a mixer, I want to help you avoid the biggest mastering mistake that most producers, artists, engineers are inclined to make the first time they get their tracks mastered. This is something that you have control over. It's a mistake that you can avoid, and I'm going to give this one to you at the end. It's super important. I coach my clients, I think, enough and give them enough information up front that I rarely see this most common mistake anymore, but it still happens occasionally, even for me. And if you're in mastering, I want to give you some ideas about how you can help your clients avoid this mistake too. And if you're an artist, producer, engineer, I want you to avoid this mistake, even if you're not mastering with me and don't get all the information that I give my clients up front. All right, let's get into that and a whole lot more. The only thing we've got to do to keep this podcast totally free to the public is to give the briefest of shout outs to our sponsors. And the biggest sponsor on this podcast, as always, is you. If you want to go super deep into the actual nuts and bolts of doing mastering, how to EQ, how to limit, how to compress, how to use widening and other stereo field manipulation in your master, how to use saturation mastering, etc., we've got all of that in Mastering Demystified, which you can get over at masteringdemystified.com. It's got a money-back guarantee. We've had thousands of students take this course. If you prefer something on mixing, we've got the full-length course, Mixing Breakthroughs. They'll change the way you mix forever for the better. And I just came out recently with a brand new course called Compression Breakthroughs. They'll change the way you hear and use compression forever for the better. So check those out. But now I want to get into hipping you to the free stuff before we get into the meat of this week's episode, and that is a free plugin, a free convolution reverb from our friends over at GPU Audio. For a limited time, you can get early access to a convolution reverb that runs on the GPU in your computer. Unless you're doing hardcore gaming or Bitcoin mining or something like that while you're mixing records, there is a GPU, this powerful resource inside your computer that's going practically unused. And it has tremendous power to run extra plugins without your computer crashing, super lightning fast. This convolution reverb from GPU.audio has practically zero latency. So go get it while it's still free over at gpu.audio/SonicScoop. That's gpu.audio/SonicScoop, where you can get limited time free early access to their convolution reverb. Definitely check it out. If you want a big discount on some of my favorite plugins, some of which I use in mastering on practically every master I do, check out iZotope over at iZotope.com/SonicScoop, where you can get 10% off any plugin they make. That's iZotope.com/SonicScoop. Also, last quick shout out and thanks to Soundtoys, making some of my favorite creative mixing effects in the known universe. Try out anything they make for free for 30 days over at soundtoys.com. All right, let's get right into the meat of this week's episode. Mastering revisions. How do they work? Are they free? Do they cost extra? Should they cost extra? How many should be included if they're included? And how do you avoid the biggest mastering mistake that there is that clients, artists, producers, engineers can make? Well, let's get into it. About a year ago, I did do an episode all about mixing revisions. So if you're interested in that topic, I have a podcast episode on that. I'll try to link to it here on the screen. And right towards the end, I kind of in passing talked a little bit about mastering revisions and the way I do them, but that's what we're going to focus on today in this episode. So mastering revisions, I'll tell you my rule. This is not a universal rule, but I say to all of my clients of my mastering services, you get unlimited revisions for free. And I say that to them because it makes them a lot more comfortable and it makes them know that there's not going to be an issue of, oh, well, what if I don't like it and I still have to pay and all that stuff. It's like, no. If you're a client of mine, you are going to walk away completely thrilled with the way that your master sounds, or you're not going to walk away. I'm not going to let you go away until you're like, wow, first of all, this actually sounds like it belongs on the shelf with all of our favorite records. It sounds way better than we ever thought it could. And honestly, I can't imagine it being able to sound better than it does now. That's what I want people to walk away believing, that they're going to have the confidence in their final production and mix where they can go out to the world and be excited to share it because they're not embarrassed by it and they're not scared of other people hearing it. And that's what I want every single one of my clients to feel. And one of the reasons I want every single one of my clients to feel that way is because there were absolutely projects that I worked on back in the day as a recording guy, as a producer, as a mixer, where I didn't feel that way. And it was just heartbreaking to spend all of this time in this project, and the final result, you're like, it could have been better. And we left out a step of improving it even further. Like, it didn't live up to its full potential. I mean, sure, maybe there are things in the recording or the mix, the performance that could have been even better. But even that aside, we either made it slightly worse or not better enough in mastering, and no one really spoke up. So I always want to make my clients feel comfortable speaking up. And I'll even just give them the opportunity, like, hey, here's where I think it sounds great. If you need any changes, let me know. And I'll even do a little bit more than that. One of the reasons I'm so confident telling my clients all revisions are included is because I rarely have to do many of them. And there's a few ways that I make that a reality. I'd say on 80% of my sessions, I do 0 revisions. And when I do them, they usually tend to be very small. And where there's significant revisions do happen, that's maybe like 10% of cases, it's usually because there was some kind of miscommunication going on in the beginning. And as much as I try to keep those miscommunications from happening, they still happen occasionally, and I'll give you the biggest reasons those miscommunications happen, and I'll give you the biggest reasons those miscommunications happen and what you can do to avoid them. But keeping this down to like a 5 or 10%, significant revision rate, I think is pretty good, and that only comes from you being on the same page with the artist, with the client from moment one. Or if you are the artist, being on the same page with a mastering engineer from moment one. And we'll talk a little bit about how to do that. But because I do so few significant revisions, I'm happy to offer that they're just always included. There is one exception though. All revisions are free if the changes are on my side of the master. If the artist needs to make changes, if after the track comes back from mastering, they realize, oh, now that I'm hearing this thing mastered, I'm realizing there's a few things I could have done better. And now I want to go back and tweak those things. I used to always charge in case they were going to send an alternate mix. But after a while, I realized that so many people really valued the fact that I would give them feedback. And based on that feedback and based on hearing the master, they could make revisions to their mix. That was so valuable to them. I said, let's just bake it into the price. This is how much I charge for mastering, and it includes one alternate master as well. So if one time you want to do a alternate master from a new mix, I'm happy to do that at no additional charge. And if you don't use that, we can use that extra version that I bake in there as, say, an instrumental or an a cappella version or a radio edit, whatever. I'll accept one alternate mix of the song, no additional price, just because I know that that is one of the major values that today a mastering engineer can offer to a producer, a mixer, an artist, to give them mix feedback and help them improve in their craft in real time, simply by listening to the music in a better environment and getting it to a place where it's as close as possible to standing up to their favorite stuff, and thereby revealing those things that can't be improved in mastering, and that you'd have to go back a tick into the mix to try to improve further. So I always want to give people the opportunity to send me one revised mix if they feel like they need to do it. I think that's something that gives me an edge in my mastering services, but I don't want it to give me an edge. If you're a mastering person, I'd recommend that you potentially think about doing this too, even if that means slightly raising your prices so that you can fit this into more of your projects. I think it's something that people would just love to have that safety net there and not feel like they're going to get nickeled and dimed and not feel like there's some obstacle to them doing the right thing, which is improving that mix slightly. This also works even better for you as a mastering engineer because you get to have worked on even more projects that sound really, really, really good, which helps increase the likelihood that more people come to you for mastering because they'll hear those projects and go, wow, that sounded great. Who is the person who mastered it? Can you recommend me the mastering person? And they'll say it was this person. And they even helped give me feedback on my mix and helped me improve my mix and didn't charge me extra when I sent back a new version of that same mix. Man, that's like free advertising. That's great. You should do it. It shouldn't just be me doing this. I'm sure there's some other mastering engineers who do this, but I'm going to suggest that more should. Now, I will give you a caveat here. I'm not saying that this is the norm and that you should expect it from your mastering engineer, but it's what I do. There's probably some other mastering engineers that do it. And if you are a mastering engineer, particularly one who works on a digital system, you should consider doing it too. One of the big problems here is if you're working with a mastering engineer who's primarily on an analog system where there's a lot more analog recall, they honestly probably really have to charge you if you're going to do an alternate version of a mix. It takes a little while. I know. I used to work on an analog mastering system. It takes a little while to recall everything. That's real time and money out of the day. That's above and beyond what it takes to do this in a digital system. Even the digital recall takes some effort too. The mix that comes back, it probably needs some additional adjustment. You've got to get your ears in tune with the references for that track again. So it's not just instant, even with a digital system. But if you're working with a mastering engineer who relies a lot on analog stuff, it's less likely that they're going to be able to include this kind of thing in the price. So be aware of that. Okay, next big thing. And this is how I avoid having to do so many revisions to begin with. And this is what cuts down on my revision time that allows me to offer this kind of extra thing where I allow people to potentially send a new mix if they need to. And that is that when in doubt, I will always send clients an alternate version. That's one part of it. And so I don't even have to do that. I want to limit the doubt. And the way I limit the doubt is by getting references from the client. And here I'm speaking not just to you mastering people, but to you artists, producers, mixers who are sending your stuff off to get mastered. Have references in mind that you're actually going to listen to your final master against in real life. And when I say references, I don't mean spiritual references. I mean sonic references. And this is the number one mistake that artists, producers, mixers make that lead the mastering session to require more revisions and to get them to a place where they're really not satisfied with the end results. And that's not providing relevant references that they're really going to compare their record against. Every once in a while, I will still get artists, producers, engineers, and this is especially artists who do this. They'll give me like their favorite bands, their favorite songwriters, the music they grew up on, the stuff that, they loved growing up, their favorite songwriters, musicians, performers. And that's awesome. I like to know that stuff. I consider those things spiritual references, but they're not necessarily sonic references. Sometimes an artist will give me a whole bunch of names of other bands or artists from the 1960s or the 1970s or the 1980s, and those are the artists that they love. I get it. But are those the artists where you're actually going to pull up their record and listen to your record next to it to make sure it's loud enough or bright enough or has enough bass? And in many cases, if probably most cases, where I have someone give me their spiritual references as their sonic references, that's where a revision needs to happen because they say, hey, this is really cool. I like what you did. It sounds so much better than it was, but I was comparing it to some other records in a playlist and it's not quite as loud or it's not quite as bright or it doesn't have quite as much bass. And I'm like, oh, that's interesting. I actually listened to this against all of the references you're talking about. And it's actually as loud as them. We're a little bit louder. It actually has as much bass. And it's actually, it's a little bit brighter on top. So is there something else you were listening to this next to? And they're like, well, yeah, I listened to like all of these other records that I never told you about. And those are the ones that like I put on a playlist next to it to actually compare how my record sounds. And I'm like, those are your sonic references. Those are the records you should have told me about before I started mastering your record. And I get it. I get it that no one's born knowing this. And you, as a mastering engineer, can't be like all high and mighty and say, I can't believe you didn't know that. Like, you've got to get into their shoes. And it's like, this is their first time paying a mastering engineer. They haven't been through this process. They don't know that unless you tell them that. So if you want to cut down on revisions, you've got to word things in such a way where you're asking for references and you're making it clear where you're asking for references for things like loudness, brightness, amount of bass, etc. And in that context, when someone fires back at you with a bunch of references that are, say, more than 2 decades old, you fire back to them and say, oh, great, this is cool stuff. I love having an excuse to listen to this music. These are some of my favorite bands. Hopefully that's true, and you have some of the same favorite bands at least. But then you also say, are there any other more modern things that you're likely to compare this against that you want it to stand up again? Are there also more modern things that we want to make sure we stand up against, or something along those lines? And then they'll get it, and they'll usually think about it a little longer and send you all the things that they were going to actually compare the master to later on. And it's good to find that stuff out from the beginning. Now, every once in a while, there will be artists who are like, nah, my favorite artists are 70s artists, and I want this record to sound like it comes out of the 70s. I don't care if that means that's not going to be as loud, not going to be as limited, doesn't have as much low end, the highs aren't as sparkly and dazzling. It's, all of these things where if they actually compare their record to modern records, it's going to, fall short of them in some ways. They don't care about that. And they literally want it to sound like a record from decades ago. That occasionally happens. But that's probably going to be like 2 to 5% of the masters that you do. So just bear that in mind when you get an artist who sends you a whole bunch of records that are 2 decades or more old. Or if you are the artist, producer, or mixer who is giving someone a list of records that are 2 decades or more old. I find this is a more common problem for artists than it is for producers and mixers. And it's a more common problem for people who are doing their first master than people who are doing their second or third. So that's the one big mistake I want you to avoid. And if you are mastering for other people, it's the one big mistake that I want you to help your clients avoid. Because at the end of the day, even if the artist, the musician, the band is saying, we don't care how other records sound, this is our unique voice and all that, and I'm sure it's true. But ultimately, they're going to, after they get their master back, listen to it against other records and say to themselves, how does this stand up? And you want to know what those things are going to be that they're going to be trying to measure up against before you start mastering. If you can get that out of the way, you are going to cut your mastering revision rate down dramatically. Now, there are some problems with references where you might get references that are all over the map. What to do then? Well, this is the situation where I give people multiple versions. I try not to give people more than 2 different versions of the master. Every once in a while, I'll give them 3, but I really try not to do that. This is most likely to occur because the artist gave me 2 different references and they both sound totally different from each other. That's why I really prefer to get at least 3 references, because then I can kind of use them to like triangulate in on the right spot, If I have 3 different records and they all sound kind of different from each other, I'll be like, well, I probably shouldn't go more bassy than the bassiest one. I probably shouldn't go brighter than the brightest one. And, I probably shouldn't go louder than the loudest one or quieter than the quietest one. So I can use those features to kind of give me the boundaries for where are the furthest places to go that I probably don't want to push beyond the ones that are an outlier in some way. So having at least 3 is usually good in that regard, because then I can really find similarities and differences in what they are between all of the different references they've given. So when possible, I love to have at least 3 sonic references from clients. I don't care if they give me 20, like that's fine. I might not listen to all 20. I might skim through all 20 and then pick the 3 that I think are the most relevant to what they're doing and just use those. But for me, the more the merrier. I'd rather have too much and kind of throw some away than have too little. But say I'm just given 1 reference or I'm just given 2 and the 2 sound pretty different. I might be like, well, here's what it sounds like if I go in direction A, and here's what it sounds like if I go in direction B. One of the records that you sent me was way darker than your mix, and one was way brighter. So I did one that I took in a little bit of a darker direction and one that I took in a little bit of a brighter direction. It sounds good both ways. Here's my favorite. In this case, it's the darker one. But just in case you were really hoping for it to sound like that brighter record, here's also a brighter one. So that's what I'll often do or have to do when I only get one or two different records as references from a client. There might be also cases where I give them three versions because it's like, well, one of your references was a lot darker, one was a lot brighter. Here's what it sounds like if I go, significantly darker and significantly brighter with this record. There's two different approaches to mastering here. They could both work if we get things in the right proportions. But also, I might give them just like a flatter master where it's like, here's one where I just respect what you were doing here. You were already kind of between these both extremes, and we don't have to go in either of those directions. So here's a flatter one where I try to do more minimal EQ, and I'm really keeping it as un-EQ'd and unprocessed as possible, but still sounding good. And then I'll give them my preference out of those. And it might be like, here's what going towards your references sound like. But honestly, if we just keep it with how it already is, it's fine. This is my favorite one, the flatter one. Or in another context, I might say, hey, based on the style of the production, based on the genre that you guys really feel like, man, going closer to this brighter record, that was the way to do it. That's my favorite, but just in case, here's a darker, and maybe here's a flatter. But I try not to give 2 and 3 if I don't have to. I don't want to confuse people. I want these additional versions that I send to be of real benefit to them, where it's kind of clear that they haven't really thought through what the end mastered sound is supposed to be. And I want to think that through with them now so they come up with a decision that makes a lot of sense. And honestly, it's much easier on me if I don't have to recall the track later. If I know there's a chance they might have asked for the brighter version or the slightly louder version, I'd rather just send it now than have like a 50% chance that I might have to send it later. So sometimes I will send 2 or 3 versions. Hey, quick question for you. Totally separate note from the rest of this podcast. I just turned on my air conditioner. I just installed this like new air conditioner here that's supposed to be super quiet, but it's a little louder than I'd like it to be. Are you hearing it in the podcast? Let me know in the comments down below or email me at podcast@sonicscoop.com if you want to answer this question or if you have any questions of your own. Can I get away with the volume of this air conditioner in here? Or am I going to have to switch to a dynamic microphone? You let me know what you think in the comments down below. Also, let me know what you think about this approach to revisions in the comments down below. Do you master records? If you do, let me know. What approach do you take to keep revisions down? How do you handle revisions when clients ask for them? Do you have a limit to how many revisions there are? Do you have to charge extra for them? Does you being on an analog or a digital system change this? If you are an artist, producer, mixer who's worked with mastering engineers, what have been some of the best practices that you've encountered? What have been some of the things that have worked for you the best? And what have been some of the things that worked for you the least? Please let me know on that front as well. Also, if you're someone who's listening to this who has mastered a record with me, chime in the comments down below. Let me know, how was the experience for you? Is there anything you would change about my process? Is there anything about it that worked relative to other mastering experiences you've had? I'd love to hear from you in the comments down below, or you can shoot me an email over at podcast@sonicscoop.com. I told you I'd give you the biggest mistake that artists, producers, mixers make when it comes to mastering, and I think I already did. That was the idea of not giving sonic references and just giving spiritual references instead. However, there's one more big mistake. This is the bonus big mistake number 2 that artists, producers, and mixers can make when it comes to a mastering session. And that is when something doesn't feel right, when something in that record doesn't satisfy you, when you're not happy with something in there, just keeping your mouth shut and thinking, well, the mastering engineer is the super important mastering engineer guy, and he must know more than me, and he must know how the record should really sound, and even if I don't really love it, I guess he's right. No, don't do that. Don't just 100% defer to the mastering engineer's expertise. The mastering engineer probably does have some expertise that you don't. However, their expertise is in figuring out A, how the record should really sound, which really means how you want it to sound, how you really want it to come across, and helps bridge that gap for you of translating your desires, your wants for this record into a final product that comes as close to that as possible and hopefully even exceeds your expectations. That's where their real expertise is in getting you from your desires of where you want the record to be to actually getting there. And their expertise is going to be in helping you to bridge that gap better than you could do on your own, with your own skills or in your own listening environment, or just giving you a second set of ears and a second QC to make sure you're winding up there. Their area of expertise is not necessarily in knowing what you want your record to sound like and what your tastes are and whether you like things darker or brighter, or whether you're trying to be more in this era or more in that one, or more in this genre or more in that one. That's stuff that is 100% driven by artists and producers and mixers to a lesser extent after the artist and producer. And the mastering engineer needs to know that stuff and shouldn't be deciding that entirely for you. You're an artist. You have a vision. You have preferences. Let those be known. Feel free to defer where you don't have strong opinions, but where something feels off to you, definitely say something. Don't go to the end of the road with your project, not satisfied, not thrilled beyond your expectations of how the record could have come out, given the circumstances you were working in. Now, in doing this, there is a chance you might get some reasonable and potentially good pushback from a mastering engineer. That mastering engineer, in my opinion, should not be telling you that what you want is wrong, but they might identify problems and trade-offs that might occur if you try to go too far in that direction. Like, say you want to load your record with even more low end. It's like, okay, we can do that, but you might not be able to get it as loud without sounding super squashed and having a ton of artifacts. Or you might want your record to be really loud, and that mastering engineer might say, well, if we're going to push this thing even louder into the realm of these other records, we're actually going to have to get rid of some low end and make things a little bit brighter, right? So that's one set of trade-offs, the trade-offs between amount of lows and amount of loudness you can get without undue artifacts. And there's a range in there, and some of that is based on taste, but a good mastering engineer shouldn't be making you feel bad for asking that question. They should be saying, in my opinion, what I would say, which is, all right, awesome, let's try to do that. Here's the problem we might run into. Let's see how far we can push it before we run into that problem. And maybe here's two versions. Here's one where I push it a little bit. Here's one where I push it a lot. I recommend in this case the one where I just push it a little bit. Or I might say, hey, you were right. We could push it a lot further this way. Here's what it would sound like really far in that direction. And I think you can actually get away with pushing it even more. I didn't know that's what you wanted based on the discussions we had. But now that I do, I'm happy to take it there. And the record totally works when we add the bottom end, or when we do more loudness, or when we go more wide, whatever it might be. So that's a conversation you should always be willing to have. And in my opinion, it's a conversation your mastering engineer should always be excited to have. And I like that when I know that my clients are so invested in their record that they have a little bit of feedback, a little bit of something that they feel like they can go even further with. And I'll tell you what, half the time we'll do some alternate version, on a revision. These 20%, 30% of cases where I do a revision, we'll do a revision, and maybe in half of those cases or more, we don't even use the revised track. We use the original master I gave them. But that's okay. And to me, it's not a waste of time. You know why? Because now the artist gets to walk away knowing with great confidence that they made the right choice for their record. And that's absolutely beautiful. Anyway, that's my approach to mastering revisions. Like I said, some people might do it a little bit differently, and some people might have to do it a little bit differently. But I hope this makes sense to you. I'd encourage you to totally steal this from me if you want to. If it works super well for you, let me know. Drop a note in here, or maybe tell the whole world that you got the idea from me. But I don't even care about that. Do what works, and I hope this works for you. If you ever want to master records with me, you absolutely can. Or if you ever want to learn how to master from me, we got the full-length course on mastering called Mastering Demystified, which you can get with a 30-day money-back guarantee over at masteringdemystified.com. It's everything you need to get started mastering for yourself, whether it's mastering your own tracks, mastering tracks for others, or if you want to get a really holistic view of the mastering process as a producer or mixer, so you really know what to expect out of mastering, even if you always go to another mastering engineer. The course will still help you there. So check it out at masteringdemystified.com. If you prefer something that's all about mixing, definitely check out the full system for mixing over at mixingbreakthroughs.com. Also, 30-day money-back guarantee on that one. It will change the way you mix forever for the better, making your finishing rate go way up, your quality and creativity go way up, while your time to complete mixes goes down. Is all that possible? Absolutely. We've had thousands of students take this course, and the testimonials we get say exactly that. So definitely check it out over at mixingbreakthroughs.com. It will change the way you mix forever for the better. Last but not least, on the course front, if you want to really get a handle on learning to hear and use compression better than you ever thought you could, got the course for you. It is Compression Breakthroughs. Check it out over at compressionbreakthroughs.com. I also have some free stuff to give you. We've got a free plugin to give you this week. It is from our friends over at GPU Audio. Your computer has a CPU in it. That's its central processing unit, I think. There's also a GPU. It's graphic processing unit. And that graphics processing unit is what allows you to render beautiful visuals that you don't really need at all most of the time you're mixing or producing music. But you know what would be cool? If you could use that super powerful GPU to run a whole bunch of extra plugins, even really powerful plugins live with practically zero latency, things that are notorious CPU hogs like convolution reverbs. Wait a second, GPU Audio offers that, and you can get a free convolution reverb plugin from them at gpu.audio/SonicScoop. That's gpu.audio/SonicScoop. This is a limited time early access option to their convolution reverb plugin. It's free right now, but it ain't going to be free forever. So go over to gpu.audio/SonicScoop. Also, our friends at iZotope were kind enough to give a 10% discount link to any of their plugins over at iZotope.com/SonicScoop. That's iZotope.com/SonicScoop for 10% off any plugin they make. Or if you want to try out their Music Production Suite Pro bundle, you can get a 30-day free trial on it instead of the usual 7-day free trial. Last but not least, Sound Toys, makers of some of my favorite creative mixing effects in the known universe. Try out anything they make for free for 30 days over at soundtoys.com. Thanks again for hanging out with me for this week's episode of the SonicScoop podcast. This has been Justin Colletti of SonicScoop. See you next time.